The morning of August 12, 1943, at Camp Hearn, Texas, Corporal Friedrich Bauer stood in the mess hall line, a metal tray trembling slightly in his hands. Around him, 200 German prisoners of war shuffled forward in silence, their eyes fixed on the serving counter ahead. Steam rose from industrial vats, carrying a smell that made Friedrich's stomach contract with involuntary hunger. Meat cooking, bread baking, something else he could not identify. The man ahead of him received his portion and moved on. Friedrich stepped forward. An American cook, barely 20 years old, with flour dusting his sleeves, scooped scrambled eggs onto the tray. Real eggs, not the powdered substitute that had become common in the Wehrmacht by 1942. The portions were enormous, covering nearly a quarter of the metal surface. Next came sausages, 2 thick links, the casings splitting to reveal seasoned pork inside. Then something white and grainy. Rice, mounded beside the meat as if it cost nothing at all. Friedrich accepted the tray and walked to a table in stunned silence. He sat down, looked at his food, and felt the foundation of everything he had been taught about this war begin to crack. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This moment, replicated thousands of times across dozens of prison camps in the American South and West during 1943 and 1944, represented more than just a meal. It represented a confrontation between ideology and material reality, between propaganda and abundance, between what German soldiers had been told about their enemy and what that enemy was actually capable of providing. The question that would haunt Friedrich Bauer and tens of thousands of his fellow prisoners was simple but devastating. If America could afford to feed its captured enemies this well, what did that mean for Germany's chances of winning the war? To understand the full impact of that question, we must first understand what these men had been taught to believe and what circumstances had brought them to American soil in the first place. The year 1943 marked a turning point in World War II. In Europe, the tide had begun to turn against Germany. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in February had cost the Wehrmacht an entire army. In the Atlantic, improved Allied tactics and technology were steadily winning the war against German U-boats, and in North Africa, the campaign that had once seemed to promise Axis control of the Middle East and its oil fields had collapsed completely. The Afrika Korps, Germany's elite desert fighting force under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been ground down through months of combat against British and Commonwealth forces. When American troops entered the theatre in November of 1942 through Operation Torch, landing in Morocco and Algeria, the strategic situation became untenable. By May of 1943, trapped between British forces advancing from Egypt and American forces pushing from the west, more than 275,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. This sudden influx of prisoners created an immediate problem for the Allies. Britain, already crowded and resource-strained after years of war, could not house them all. The decision was made to transport tens of thousands of German and Italian prisoners across the Atlantic to the United States, where vast spaces and distance from the fighting provided natural security. For the German soldiers boarding those transport ships in June and July of 1943, the journey represented a descent into the unknown. They had been raised on a specific narrative about America, one carefully constructed by the Nazi propaganda apparatus over the previous decade. According to this narrative, the United States was a culturally weak nation, mongrelized by immigration, corrupted by Jewish finance, and lacking the martial spirit necessary for sustained warfare. Americans were portrayed as soft, addicted to luxury, incapable of the sacrifices required for military greatness. Their industrial capacity, while acknowledged, was dismissed as the product of theft and exploitation rather than genuine capability. The Nazi press frequently published articles suggesting that American soldiers would crumble when faced with the disciplined power of German troops. This propaganda was not entirely cynical. Many Germans genuinely believed it. The National Socialist worldview divided humanity into hierarchies of racial and cultural superiority, with Germans at the apex and mixed populations like America's somewhere far below. Military success in the early years of the war seemed to confirm these beliefs. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in months. German armies had reached the outskirts of Moscow and penetrated deep into Egypt. Against this backdrop of victory, American power seemed like an abstraction, a potential threat but not an immediate one. For soldiers like Friedrich Bauer, a 24-year-old from Stuttgart, who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1941, these ideas formed the unquestioned background of his worldview. He had fought in North Africa, believing that German superiority would inevitably triumph over American material advantages. Capture had forced him to question that belief, but the full implications had not yet sunk in. The transport ships carrying prisoners to America took between 3 and 4 weeks to make the crossing, depending on convoy speed and weather conditions. The men were housed below deck in converted cargo holds, sleeping in tiered bunks with minimal privacy or comfort. The voyage was not deliberately cruel, but neither was it pleasant. Many prisoners suffered from seasickness, anxiety, and the psychological weight of an unknown future. Friedrich kept a diary during the crossing, pencil entries scratched into a small notebook he had somehow retained through capture and processing. His entry from the 10th day at sea captures the prevailing mood. "We do not know what awaits us. The American guards on this ship are not harsh, but they tell us nothing. At night I hear men praying, others cursing, most simply lying silent in the dark. We were told Americans would be vengeful, that we might not survive captivity. I wonder if I will see Germany again." The propaganda about American vengefulness had been particularly intense. Nazi media had portrayed the United States as a nation controlled by Jewish interests bent on destroying Germany utterly. German soldiers were taught that capture by Americans would mean harsh treatment, possible execution, certainly starvation. This messaging served a dual purpose. It motivated soldiers to fight harder to avoid capture, and it prepared those who were captured to interpret any hardship as confirmation of American cruelty. Reality began to undermine these expectations almost immediately upon landing. When the ships docked in New York, Boston, and other East Coast ports, the prisoners were brought topside and marched down gangplanks onto American soil. Friedrich Bauer emerged into daylight, expecting to see an angry mob waiting to attack. Instead, he saw dock workers going about their business, cranes swinging cargo, and in the distance, the unmistakable skyline of a functioning, prosperous city. No one was screaming, no one was throwing stones. The war felt very far away. American soldiers, many looking barely older than the prisoners themselves, formed the prisoners into columns and marched them to waiting trains. The discipline was firm but not brutal. Guards carried rifles but did not use them. When one prisoner stumbled from exhaustion, an American soldier helped him to his feet and offered water from a canteen. These small acts of ordinary decency created cognitive dissonance. The prisoners had been prepared for cruelty, not kindness. They searched for hidden motives, secret intentions. Perhaps the Americans were simply better at psychological warfare than expected. Perhaps the harsh treatment would come later, once they were away from public view. The trains departed with their cargo of captured soldiers, heading south and west into America's interior. For days, the prisoners watched the country unfold through barred windows, and what they saw shook them more profoundly than any interrogation could have. The landscape was overwhelming in its scale. Fields stretched to the horizon without apparent boundaries. Barns rose like cathedrals, built not from stone but from wood so abundant it seemed to have been used carelessly. Farmhouses dotted the countryside, each one larger and more substantial than the peasant cottages common in rural Germany. Sergeant Klaus Richter, a tank commander from Bavaria, pressed his face to the window glass as the train rolled through Ohio farmland. He had grown up in a village where a 50-acre farm was considered substantial. Here, he could see individual properties that seemed to encompass hundreds of acres, all cultivated, all productive. The mathematical implications were staggering. Klaus began taking notes on scraps of paper, calculating rough estimates based on what he observed. If each of these farms produced even a fraction of what German farms produced per acre, and there were thousands of such farms, then the total agricultural output of America must be almost inconceivable. And this was food production during wartime, when agricultural labor was supposedly scarce due to military conscription. At night, the trains passed through cities, and the prisoners encountered another shock. The cities were lit. Street lamps glowed. Neon signs advertised businesses. Apartment windows showed bright and uncurtained, as if no one feared enemy bombers dropping death from the sky. The prisoners, accustomed to the strict blackout regulations enforced throughout Europe, stared in disbelief. "They do not even try to hide," whispered Ernst Heinemann, a corporal from Hamburg. "Either they are fools, or they have never known real war." But there was a third possibility that none of them wanted to voice. Perhaps America was so powerful, so distant from the fighting, so secure in its strength, that it simply did not need to fear. The trains stopped periodically at small rural stations to take on water or change crews. At some of these stops, something remarkable happened. Local American women, members of Red Cross auxiliaries or church groups, appeared with baskets of food. They offered sandwiches, cookies, coffee in thermoses to the guards, and, incredibly, to the prisoners as well. The first time this happened, the prisoners refused. It had to be a trick, a poisoning attempt, some form of psychological torture. But the guards ate from the same baskets without hesitation. Eventually, hunger overcame suspicion. The prisoners accepted the food and ate cautiously, waiting for sickness that never came. The sandwiches contained thick slices of bread, butter, ham, and cheese. Real cheese, not the ersatz varieties made from vegetable oils that had become standard in Germany. The cookies were sweet, made with actual sugar and chocolate chips. The coffee was genuine coffee, not the roasted grain substitutes German civilians had learned to tolerate. Hans Vogel, a 19-year-old conscript from Hamburg, bit into a ham sandwich and felt tears sting his eyes. He had not tasted food this good since before the war began. His last letter from his mother, received weeks before his capture, had described standing in line for hours to purchase bread that contained sawdust as filler. And here, enemy civilians were giving away better food than his family could buy with ration coupons. By the time the trains reached their destinations, camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and other southern states, the prisoners had already begun to question what they thought they knew. But the real revelation was yet to come. Camp Hearn in Texas was typical of the larger POW installations built to house German prisoners. Constructed in late 1942 and early 1943, it consisted of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. The layout was functional but not deliberately harsh. Each barrack housed 40 to 50 men in bunks, with communal washrooms and latrine facilities. The structures had electricity, running water, and heating for the winter months. When Friedrich Bauer's group arrived at Camp Hearn in early August of 1943, they were processed, issued prison uniforms marked with PW, stenciled on the legs, and assigned to barracks. The guards explained the camp rules through interpreters. No escape attempts, no violence, cooperation with work details would be rewarded, and prisoners would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929. That evening, the prisoners were marched to the mess hall for dinner. This would be their first full meal on American soil, their first encounter with the realities of American abundance, and for many, the beginning of a profound psychological transformation. The mess hall was a long wooden structure with rows of tables and benches. Steam tables lined one wall, tended by American cooks and German prisoners who had been selected for kitchen duty. The smell of cooking food filled the space with an intensity that was almost painful after months of field rations and deprivation. Friedrich took his place in line. As he shuffled forward, he watched the men ahead of him receive their portions. Each tray was loaded with more food than a German soldier would typically receive in an entire day. Scrambled eggs, sausages, bread, butter, and that strange white grain he would later learn was rice. When his turn came, Friedrich accepted his tray with hands that shook slightly. He carried it to a table, sat down, and stared at what he had been given. Beside him, Otto Schultz, a tank driver who had fought at El Alamein, whispered, "This is not possible. No nation feeds its prisoners like this." But it was possible, and it was happening. The food was real, the portions were genuine, and this was not some special occasion but simply the standard evening meal at a prisoner of war camp in the American South in 1943. Friedrich picked up his fork and began to eat. The eggs were perfectly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper. The sausages were pork, real meat without fillers or substitutes. The bread was soft, made from white flour he had not tasted since peacetime. The butter was actual dairy butter, not margarine. And there was rice. White rice, slightly sticky, seasoned with butter and salt. Friedrich had eaten rice perhaps 3 times in his entire life, always at expensive restaurants, always as a special luxury. In Germany, rice was an import crop that had become increasingly scarce even before the war. It was exotic, expensive, something associated with wealth and special occasions. Here, it was a side dish served to prisoners, treated with the casual disregard of something utterly ordinary and abundant. The realization came gradually, meal by meal, day by day. This was not a special circumstance or a temporary gesture. This was simply how things were. According to official records maintained by the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, the standard prisoner of war ration in 1943 was designed to provide approximately 3,000 calories per day. This figure was not arbitrary. It was mandated by Article 11 of the Geneva Convention, which required that prisoners of war be fed rations equivalent in quantity and quality to those provided to depot troops of the capturing nation. The United States Army took this obligation seriously, sometimes to the frustration of American civilians who faced their own wartime rationing programs. Meat, sugar, coffee, and other staples were rationed for civilians through a complex system of coupons and allocation priorities. Yet prisoners of war, enemy soldiers who had fought against American troops, received guaranteed rations that often exceeded what civilians could purchase with their allotted coupons. This created occasional controversy. Some newspapers published articles questioning why German prisoners ate meat daily, while American families struggled to purchase beef. Military authorities responded by pointing to treaty obligations and the need to maintain America's moral standing in the international community. If the United States violated the Geneva Convention, it would give Germany license to mistreat American prisoners in return. The rations continued. For the prisoners themselves, the abundance was incomprehensible when compared to conditions in Germany. By late 1943, the average German civilians in major cities received approximately 1,500 calories per day through official ration channels. Those engaged in heavy industrial or agricultural labor might receive supplements, bringing them to around 2,000 calories. Pregnant women and nursing mothers received small additional allowances, but even these enhanced rations fell significantly short of what was considered adequate for sustained health and productivity. The German military, of course, received priority in food allocation. Soldiers at the front were supposed to receive around 2,500 to 3,000 calories per day, with combat troops getting additional supplements. But these were theoretical figures that often broke down in practice due to supply problems, transportation difficulties, and the chaos of retreat. By 1943, many German units were struggling with inadequate rations, particularly on the Eastern Front where Soviet forces had begun, pushing back with devastating force. The prisoners knew these facts intimately. Many had experienced hunger themselves during the final months of the North African campaign as supply lines collapsed. Others had received letters from family members describing worsening conditions at home. To sit in an American mess hall eating scrambled eggs and sausage, while their wives and children back in Germany queued for hours to buy bread cut with sawdust, created a psychological burden that was almost unbearable. Ernst Heinemann captured this feeling in his diary entry from August 15, 1943. Today we had meat at both lunch and dinner. Real meat, not the mystery tinned substance we received in the Afrika Korps. At lunch, pork chops with rice. At dinner, beef stew with potatoes and carrots. I ate until I was full, then felt sick with guilt. My wife's last letter mentioned they have begun mixing turnips into the bread to stretch the flour ratio. She did not complain, only stated it as fact. Meanwhile, I eat pork chops and grow fat in captivity. The guilt was corrosive, but so was the implication underlying it. If the United States could feed its prisoners this well while simultaneously supplying its own military, supporting its allies through the Lend-Lease program, and maintaining civilian morale at home, then the industrial and agricultural capacity of America must be operating on a scale that German propaganda had never acknowledged. The rice became a symbol of this disparity. In Germany, rice consumption before the war had averaged less than 1 kilogram per person per year. It appeared in shops sporadically, priced as a luxury item, purchased mainly by wealthy urban families or for special holiday meals. Most Germans encountered rice only as an ingredient in expensive rice puddings or as a component of exotic dishes served at fine restaurants. The idea of rice as a common side dish, as ordinary as potatoes, was completely foreign to German food culture. Potatoes formed the foundation of German cuisine, boiled, mashed, fried, baked, or made into dumplings and pancakes. Cabbage, turnips, and rye bread filled out most meals. Rice simply was not part of the everyday dietary repertoire. Yet, in American POW camps, rice appeared 3 to 4 times per week, sometimes more. It was served as a side dish with meat, mixed into soups, used as a base for stews, and occasionally even prepared as a sweet dessert. The prisoners learned to eat it, some reluctantly, others with growing appreciation. But regardless of individual preferences, the sheer availability of rice carried a message about American agricultural capacity that no amount of propaganda could counter. The United States had been growing rice commercially since the 18th century, with cultivation concentrated in South Carolina initially, and later expanding to Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, and California. By the 1940s, American rice production had become highly mechanized and extraordinarily productive. According to Department of Agriculture statistics, rice production in 1943 exceeded 1.2 billion pounds. This supplied domestic consumption, military requirements, exports to allies, and yes, prisoner of war camps across the country. The scale of production was made possible by several factors that simply did not exist in Germany. First, the United States possessed vast areas of suitable rice-growing terrain, flat, water-rich lowlands in the Mississippi Delta and Gulf Coast regions, plus the Central Valley of California. These areas featured the warm climate, abundant water supply, and suitable soil conditions ideal for rice cultivation. Second, American agriculture had undergone rapid mechanization in the decades before the war. Tractors replaced horses and mules. Mechanical harvesters replaced hand labor. Irrigation systems were installed on a massive scale. A single farmer with modern equipment could work hundreds of acres that would have required dozens of laborers in previous generations. Third, the American transportation infrastructure moved agricultural products from farms to processing facilities to distribution points with remarkable efficiency. Railroads crisscrossed the country, hauling grain cars from rice-growing regions to mills and warehouses. Refrigerated trucks delivered perishable goods. The entire system, largely undamaged by war, functioned with a reliability that was almost invisible until compared to the deteriorating infrastructure of wartime Germany. Germany possessed none of these advantages. German agriculture remained heavily dependent on manual labor and animal power. The mechanization that had transformed American farming was limited in Germany due to smaller farm sizes, less capital investment, and fuel shortages that made tractors impractical for many operations. The country's arable land was more limited and already intensively cultivated for traditional staple crops. Rice had never been grown commercially in Germany. It was purely an import crop, and with maritime trade disrupted by war, imports had dwindled to almost nothing. For prisoners eating their third serving of rice and pork in a Texas mess hall, these abstract economic factors translated into a simple, devastating truth. Germany could not match American productive capacity, not in food, not in raw materials, not in the fundamental ability to supply and sustain a prolonged war effort. The meals continued, day after day, with a monotonous regularity that was itself revealing. Breakfast at 6 in the morning, eggs, meat, bread, milk, occasionally pancakes or French toast. Lunch at noon. Meat, vegetables, starch, rice or potatoes, bread, dessert. Dinner at 6 in the evening, another substantial meal, often featuring a different protein but equally abundant. The menus were planned by army dietitians to meet nutritional requirements and prevent deficiency diseases. They rotated to provide variety but maintained consistent caloric values. Special diets were available for those with medical conditions. Jewish prisoners, if they requested it, could receive meals prepared according to kosher guidelines, though in practice most had long since abandoned strict religious dietary laws under the pressures of military service and captivity. The cooks preparing these meals were often German prisoners themselves, selected for their culinary experience and willingness to cooperate. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It reduced the manpower burden on American personnel, ensured the food was prepared in ways familiar to German tastes, and gave the prisoners a sense of purpose and responsibility. These prisoner cooks took pride in their work. Given ingredients that surpassed anything available in wartime Germany, they created meals that sometimes approached restaurant quality. They learned to prepare rice properly, having been instructed by American cooks in the techniques of boiling, steaming, and seasoning. They made gravies from meat drippings, baked bread that reminded prisoners of home, roasted vegetables to bring out their natural sweetness. One prisoner at Camp Herne, a professional baker from Munich named Josef Keller, gained particular fame among his fellow captives for his rice pudding. Using surplus rice, whole milk, sugar, vanilla extract, and raisins, he created a dessert that appeared on tables once or twice a month. The pudding was sweet, creamy, flavored with cinnamon, studded with plump raisins that had been soaked in warm water to soften them. The first time Josef's rice pudding appeared, in October of 1943, the mess hall fell into an awed silence as men ate it. Some closed their eyes, transported back to childhood memories of Christmas or birthdays when similar desserts had graced family tables. Others ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, knowing that such luxury had become impossible in Germany itself. After that meal, Klaus Richter wrote in his notes, "Today we were served rice pudding as dessert." Rice pudding, made from a grain so rare in Germany that most families never purchase it. Here, it is used for dessert, for a sweet served to prisoners of war. I do not know how to process this information, except to conclude that we are fighting an enemy whose surplus exceeds our scarcity. The abundance extended beyond food. The camp canteen, operated by German prisoners under American supervision, sold items using scrip currency that prisoners earned through work assignments. The canteen stocked cigarettes, candy, soap, writing materials, playing cards, and even musical instruments for those who wished to purchase them. The prices were subsidized, kept deliberately low to ensure that even prisoners with minimal work earnings could afford basic luxuries. A pack of cigarettes cost 10 cents in scrip. A candy bar cost 5 cents. Writing paper and envelopes were virtually free, provided to encourage prisoners to maintain correspondence with families in Germany, correspondence that was censored but not forbidden. The variety of goods available stunned prisoners accustomed to the shortages of wartime Germany. Multiple brands of cigarettes, including premium American brands and even some European imports, several types of candy, chocolate bars, hard candies, chewing gum in flavors the prisoners had never encountered, toiletries that included not just basic soap but also shaving cream, toothpaste, and even cologne. Friedrich Bauer, who had earned scrip by working on a road construction detail, purchased a chocolate bar from the canteen in September of 1943. He unwrapped it slowly, examining the packaging with its bright colors and English text. The chocolate was smooth, sweet, richer than the increasingly rare chocolate available in Germany even before the war. He ate half and saved the rest, wrapping it carefully in wax paper to preserve it. That evening, lying in his bunk, Friedrich tried to calculate what this single chocolate bar would have cost in Berlin. If it was even available, which was doubtful by 1943, it would have required a significant portion of a week's ration coupons and perhaps black market cash on top of that. Here, he had purchased it with scrip earned by a few days of casual labor that was itself less demanding than anything he had experienced in the Wehrmacht. The psychological impact of these material realities accumulated gradually. The prisoners did not suddenly lose faith in Germany or embrace American values, but they did begin to question the narratives they had been taught about American weakness, about German superiority, about the inevitable triumph of National Socialism over decadent democracy. These questions were dangerous, even in captivity. The camps contained hardcore Nazi loyalists who viewed any doubt as treason. These men, often officers or NCOs from elite units like the SS or Fallschirmjäger, maintained informal authority structures within the prison population. They enforced ideological conformity through social pressure, threats, and occasionally violence. Several incidents of prisoner-on-prisoner violence occurred in American POW camps during 1943 and 1944, usually involving German prisoners accused of being too friendly with American guards or too openly critical of Nazi ideology. In the most extreme case, at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a group of hardline Nazis beat a fellow prisoner to death for expressing pro-American sentiments. The murder led to trials and executions, but it also highlighted the tensions simmering beneath the surface of camp life. In this environment, prisoners like Friedrich Bauer kept their doubts private, expressing them only in diaries or in carefully coded letters home. The contrast between what they saw in America and what they had been taught about America created cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved. Some suppressed these thoughts, clinging to ideology despite contradictory evidence. Others allowed the evidence to slowly erode their certainty, a process that was painful and disillusioning, but ultimately irresistible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By December of 1943, most prisoners at Camp Herne had settled into routines. Work details took them out of the camp during daylight hours. They harvested cotton, repaired roads, cut timber, or performed maintenance tasks on nearby military installations. The labor was supervised but not harsh. Prisoners who worked received 80 cents per day in scrip, a wage that seemed generous when the alternative was sitting idle in camp. The work itself provided another window into American capacity. Friedrich Bauer was assigned to a labor detail that harvested rice on farms near Houston. He had never seen rice growing before. The fields were flooded deliberately, the water standing several inches deep, the green stalks rising from the shallow pools like some alien crop from another planet entirely. The farmer who employed the prison labor detail was a man named Coleman, middle-aged, pragmatic, speaking no German but communicating effectively through gestures and an interpreter. Mr. Coleman operated his farm with 2 tractors, several pieces of specialized equipment, and a small crew of regular employees supplemented by prisoner labor during harvest season. Friedrich watched as one of the tractors pulled a mechanical harvester through the rice field. The machine cut the stalks, stripped the grains, and deposited them into a following wagon, all in a single pass. The speed and efficiency were mesmerizing. In Germany, even before mechanization, rice cultivation would have required dozens of laborers performing each task by hand. Here, a single machine operator could harvest acres per day. During a water break, Mr. Coleman explained through the interpreter that he farmed 800 acres of rice plus another 600 acres of cotton and soybeans. The numbers were staggering. 800 acres. In Germany, a farmer with 50 acres was considered prosperous. 100 acres was the domain of minor nobility. But here, a single American farmer, working alone with his sons and some hired help, cultivated more land than several German villages combined. Friedrich did the calculation in his head. If Mr. Coleman's operation was typical, and if there were thousands of such farms across Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and California, then the total rice production of the United States must be almost inconceivable. And this was only rice, only one crop among many. What about wheat, corn, livestock? The mind struggled to encompass the scale. That evening, back at camp, Friedrich sat with his dinner, rice and chicken, green beans, bread, milk. He looked at the rice on his plate with new understanding. Each grain had come from fields like the ones he had worked that day. Fields so vast they required machines to harvest, machines powered by fuel that America produced domestically in quantities that made German oil imports from Romania look like a trickle. He wrote in his diary that night, "We are not fighting a nation. We are fighting a continent that happens to be organized as a nation. The difference is not subtle." Winter came to Camp Herne in late 1943, bringing cooler temperatures that the prisoners, accustomed to the brutal cold of European winters, found almost laughably mild. December in Texas meant temperatures that rarely dropped below freezing, occasional rain, and a dampness that was uncomfortable but not dangerous. The barracks had heating stoves that kept the interiors warm enough for comfort. Christmas approached, and with it came another revelation about American abundance that struck the prisoners with particular force. On December 24, 1943, the mess hall was decorated. American guards and cooperative German prisoners had strung evergreen branches along the walls and placed candles on the tables. The gesture was small, almost trivial, but it acknowledged that these enemy soldiers were also human beings who might appreciate a connection to home during the holiday season. The Christmas Eve meal was extraordinary. Turkey, a bird most German prisoners had never eaten, roasted until the skin was crispy and golden, stuffing made from bread, herbs and sausage, mashed potatoes with gravy, cranberry sauce, tart and sweet simultaneously, rolls served warm from the oven, and for dessert, pumpkin pie, a dish completely foreign to German culinary tradition, but rich and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, and rice. Even on Christmas, even during a feast meant to showcase American generosity, rice appeared on the table as a side dish, as ordinary and expected as bread. Klaus Richter sat at his table, staring at his plate, unable to begin eating. Around him, other prisoners ate slowly, some openly weeping. The contrast was too stark. In Germany, Christmas 1943 would be celebrated with whatever meagre extras families could scrape together. Perhaps a small piece of meat purchased with hoarded ration coupons, potatoes, cabbage, bread that might contain slightly less sawdust than usual. Here, prisoners of war ate turkey and pie. Klaus finally picked up his fork and began eating. The turkey was tender, seasoned with herbs he could not identify. The stuffing was savory and rich with fat. The cranberry sauce provided an acidic counterpoint to the meat's richness. He ate mechanically, tasting but not enjoying, his mind elsewhere. That evening, he wrote one of the most revealing entries in his collection of notes. "Today we celebrated Christmas with a meal that would have been excessive in peacetime Germany. I thought of my wife, Greta, and our children, and I imagined them sitting down to whatever poor supper they have managed to assemble. I am a prisoner, captured by the enemy, and yet I eat better than my own family. This reality makes me question everything I was taught about this war. If America can afford such generosity to its enemies while simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts across the world, then we never had a chance. The propaganda was not merely exaggerated, it was catastrophically, fundamentally wrong about the nature of the nation we chose to fight." The new year, 1944, brought changes to camp life. The American military began implementing formal re-education programs, attempting to expose German prisoners to democratic ideas and to counter Nazi propaganda. These programs were controversial and implemented unevenly across different camps. At Camp Herne, the re-education took subtle forms. The camp library received English-language newspapers and magazines. Prisoners with sufficient English skills could read about Allied progress in the war, the ongoing campaign in Italy, preparations for what would become the Normandy invasion, American advances in the Pacific. Educational classes were offered, teaching English, American history, and basic civics. Some prisoners attended these classes eagerly, seeing them as opportunities to learn useful skills for an uncertain future. Others boycotted them as enemy propaganda. The hardcore Nazis in the camp actively discouraged participation, viewing cooperation with re-education efforts as collaboration with the enemy. Friedrich Bauer began attending English classes in January of 1944. His motivation was practical rather than ideological. He reasoned that English would be useful regardless of how the war ended, and the classes gave him something constructive to do. The instructor was a young American lieutenant named Robertson, who had studied German in college and spoke it with a textbook precision that the prisoners found amusing. Lieutenant Robertson approached his task with genuine interest in his students. He did not lecture them about democracy or attempt to argue politics. Instead, he simply taught English grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation, using materials that happened to include American newspapers, advertisements, and radio transcripts. Through these materials, Friedrich gained insight into American civilian life during wartime. The newspapers advertised products that were unavailable in Germany: new automobiles, though production had been converted to military vehicles, household appliances, clothing, entertainment. The advertisements themselves revealed a society that, despite rationing and war restrictions, maintained a baseline prosperity that exceeded German peacetime standards. One newspaper from January 1944 contained an article about food rationing in America. The article explained that American families were limited in how much meat, butter, sugar, and coffee they could purchase. It included a sample menu showing what a family of 4 might eat in a week under rationing restrictions. Friedrich translated the menu carefully, checking his work with Lieutenant Robertson. Even with rationing, the sample American family consumed more calories and more variety than a comparable German family. They had meat several times per week, dairy products daily, fresh vegetables and fruits regularly. The article treated these restrictions as hardships, sacrifices made for the war effort. To Friedrich, they looked like abundance. He showed the article to Klaus Richter that evening. Klaus read it twice, then folded the newspaper carefully and handed it back. "This is what they consider deprivation," Klaus said quietly. "This is them doing without, and it is still more than we had before the war." The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Every piece of evidence, every meal, every newspaper article, every glimpse of American life contradicted the narrative they had been taught. Germany was supposed to be the superior civilization, disciplined and strong, while America was weak and decadent. Yet the material reality suggested exactly the opposite. By spring of 1944, the war news reaching the camp made it clear that Germany was losing. The Eastern Front had collapsed into a fighting retreat. Allied bombers were systematically destroying German industrial capacity. The anticipated invasion of Western Europe was clearly coming, and when it came in June with the Normandy landings, even the most optimistic prisoners understood that Germany's strategic position was hopeless. Still, the meals continued: rice and pork, rice and chicken, beef stew with rice. The monotonous abundance that had shocked the prisoners in 1943 became routine by 1944. They grew accustomed to eating well, even as letters from home described worsening conditions in Germany. Ernst Heinemann received a letter from his wife in July of 1944. She wrote carefully, knowing censors would read her words, but the message came through clearly. "The children ask about you constantly. Food has become very difficult. We manage, as everyone manages, but I confess there are days when managing feels like the greatest achievement possible." The bombings continue. "We spent many nights in the shelter, but we are alive, and for that I am grateful. Do not worry about us. Survive and come home when this is over." Ernst read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his footlocker. That evening at dinner, he looked at his plate: pork chops, rice, green beans, bread, butter, milk, and a slice of apple pie for dessert. He thought about his children asking about him, his wife describing how they managed with food, and he felt a shame so profound it was almost physical. He could not finish his meal. He pushed the plate away, stood up, and walked outside into the warm Texas evening. Another prisoner, seeing his distress, followed him out. "You received a letter from home," the other man said. It was not a question. Ernst nodded. "It is the same for all of us. They suffer while we eat. It makes no sense. It is the opposite of how things should be." "It makes perfect sense," Ernst said bitterly. "It means we lost this war before it began. We just did not know it." The summer of 1944 brought new work assignments. Prisoners were needed to harvest cotton, peaches, and vegetables on farms throughout central Texas. The labor shortage in America, caused by millions of men serving in the military, created opportunities for prisoner labor that benefited both the agricultural sector and the prisoners themselves, who earned scrip and escaped the boredom of camp life. Friedrich Bauer was assigned to a peach orchard near Austin. The work was pleasant in its way, climbing ladders, picking ripe fruit, filling baskets that were collected and hauled to sorting facilities. The orchard owner, an older man named Mr. Patterson, whose sons were serving overseas, treated the prisoner laborers with distant but genuine courtesy. During breaks, Mr. Patterson sometimes shared food with the workers, cold water from a well, sandwiches his wife had prepared, occasionally fresh peaches that were too ripe to ship but perfect for immediate consumption. Friedrich ate these peaches and marveled at their sweetness, at the juice that ran down his chin, at the casual abundance of a crop grown primarily for domestic consumption rather than strategic necessity. One afternoon, Mr. Patterson asked through an interpreter why Friedrich was staring at the orchards with such intensity. Friedrich struggled to explain. In Germany, he finally said, fruit like this would be reserved for officers, for the elite. Common people would never see it. Here, you grow acres of peaches and worry about having enough workers to harvest them. The difference is, I do not have words for the difference. Mr. Patterson nodded slowly. Son, he said, America's got a lot of land and a lot of people who work it. We grow more than we need, most years. That's just how it is. I reckon it's different where you come from. Friedrich agreed. It is very different. That evening, back at camp, Friedrich calculated roughly how many peaches the orchard produced. Thousands of boxes, each containing dozens of peaches, harvested over several weeks. And this was one orchard among thousands across Texas, California, Georgia, and other states. The scale was impossible to comprehend from a German perspective, where fruit was scarce even in peacetime and nearly unobtainable during the war. The rice, the meat, the peaches, the cotton fields, the wheat harvests, the dairy farms, the cattle ranches, all of it added up to a picture of productive capacity so vast that it seemed almost impossible. Yet it was real. The prisoners lived within this abundance, ate its products, worked to harvest it, and could not deny its existence. By autumn of 1944, the tone of camp life had shifted. The hardcore Nazi loyalists still existed, still enforced ideological conformity where they could, but their influence was waning. The war news was unrelentingly bad from a German perspective. The Soviet advance in the east was crushing German armies. The Western Allies had liberated France and were approaching Germany's borders. Allied bombers flew over German cities with near impunity. And in America, prisoner of war camps continued to serve rice with meat 3 times a week. The psychological transformation was not universal. Some prisoners clung to Nazi ideology, insisting that secret weapons or miraculous reversals would somehow save Germany. Others retreated into cynicism or depression, but many, perhaps most, began the slow process of accepting that everything they had believed about German superiority and American weakness had been wrong. Klaus Richter summarized this realization in a note written in November of 1944. I came to America expecting to find a weak, disorganized nation barely capable of fielding an army. Instead, I found an industrial colossus that produces more in a month than Germany produces in a year. I expected to be starved and abused as a prisoner. Instead, I have gained weight eating meals that include rice as a common side dish, rice that in Germany is a luxury item. Every assumption I held has been shattered by the simple, undeniable evidence of what I have seen with my own eyes. The Führer promised us victory based on German discipline and racial superiority, but discipline does not matter when the enemy can produce 10 tanks for every one of ours. Racial theories do not matter when the enemy's factories run 3 shifts and ours are bombed into rubble. We lost this war because we fundamentally misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Winter returned, milder than the prisoners expected, and with it came another Christmas in captivity. The 1944 Christmas meal was similar to the previous year. Turkey, stuffing, multiple side dishes, pie, and of course, rice. By now, the prisoners had grown so accustomed to American food that the feast barely registered as unusual. This normalization was itself significant. What had shocked them in 1943 now seemed routine in 1944. Friedrich Bauer ate his Christmas dinner quietly, thinking about his wife in Stuttgart. He had received a letter from her in early December. She wrote that the city had been bombed again, that their apartment building had been damaged but not destroyed, that she and the children were living with her sister in the countryside. She did not complain, did not express anger or despair, simply stated facts. But between the lines, Friedrich read exhaustion, fear, and a kind of resignation that broke his heart. After dinner, he sat in the barracks writing a response. The censors, it would read it, so he could not write freely, but he tried to convey what he needed her to know. My dear Anna, I am well. The Americans treat us fairly. We have enough to eat, shelter from weather, medical care when needed. Do not worry about me. I think often of you and the children. I hope this war ends soon so I can return home. All my love, Friedrich. What he could not write, what the censors would have deleted, was the truth he had come to understand. That Germany had lost not because of betrayal or bad luck, but because it had challenged an enemy whose productive capacity was so overwhelming that defeat was inevitable from the start. That the rice he ate 3 times a week represented a tiny fraction of American agricultural output, which in turn was only one component of an industrial economy operating on a scale Germany could never match. The year 1945 began with a sense of endings. The war in Europe was clearly in its final phase. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were fighting through Western Germany. The Nazi state was collapsing. In Camp Hearn, Texas, life continued with its strange normalcy. Work details, English classes, meals in the mess hall, rice and pork, rice and chicken, the routine of captivity in a land of abundance. In April, news reached the camp that President Roosevelt had died. Some prisoners celebrated privately, seeing his death as a possible turning point. Others recognized that Roosevelt's death would change nothing fundamental about American war-making capacity. The factories would continue operating, the farms would continue producing, the military would continue advancing. In May, Germany surrendered. The news reached Camp Hearn on May 8, 1945. The camp authorities assembled the prisoners and informed them officially that the war in Europe had ended, that Germany had capitulated unconditionally, that the Third Reich had ceased to exist. The prisoners received this news in silence. Some wept, others stood stoically, faces blank. A few collapsed, overcome by relief or grief or some mixture of both. The hardcore Nazis looked stunned, unable or unwilling to accept that their ideology had led to such complete and total defeat. Friedrich Bauer felt a strange lightness, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The war was over. He had survived. He would eventually go home, though what he would find there was uncertain. But the killing had stopped, and that alone was enough. That evening, the prisoners ate dinner in the mess hall as usual. The menu had not changed because of Germany's surrender. Rice and pork chops, green beans, bread, butter, milk, and chocolate cake for dessert. The Americans continued to feed their prisoners well even after those prisoners' nation had been defeated. Klaus Richter sat with his meal, looking at the rice on his plate, and laughed quietly. The sound was bitter and exhausting. Even in defeat, he said to the men around him, "We eat rice. They will feed us rice until we leave this place. And years from now, when I am an old man, I will taste rice. And remember this, that I learned more about power from these meals than from any battle I fought." The months following Germany's surrender were uncertain. The prisoners remained in American camps while authorities decided what to do with hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. Repatriation would take time. Transportation was limited, Europe was devastated, and the logistics of returning so many men were complex. During this period, the re-education programs intensified. Prisoners were shown footage of concentration camps, confronted with evidence of Nazi atrocities, and asked to reconsider what they had fought for. Some rejected this information as propaganda. Others accepted it with horror, realizing that they had served a regime capable of industrialized genocide. Ernst Heinemann attended one of these film screenings in June of 1945. The footage showed American soldiers liberating concentration camps, the piles of bodies, the skeletal survivors, the evidence of systematic extermination. Ernst watched in silence, feeling his stomach turn, unable to look away. Afterward, he walked outside and vomited. He had not known. Most Wehrmacht soldiers had not known the full extent of what was happening in the camps. They had heard rumors, yes, but rumors were easy to dismiss as exaggeration or enemy propaganda. This footage was neither rumor nor exaggeration. It was documentary evidence of crimes beyond comprehension. That night, Ernst wrote in his diary, "Today I learned that everything I fought for was built on evil. I did not know about the camps, not truly, but ignorance is not innocence. I wore the uniform, I fought the battles. I am implicated in what was done, even if I did not personally do it. The rice I have eaten, the comfort I have known as a prisoner, these things feel like judgment now. We do not deserve this treatment. But the Americans give it anyway, because they are bound by laws that we violated, by principles that we rejected." The process of repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Prisoners were processed in groups, transported to ports, and loaded onto ships for the return journey to Europe. The journey back was longer and more uncomfortable than the journey to America had been. The ships were more crowded, the accommodations more Spartan, but no one complained. They were going home. Friedrich Bauer departed Camp Herne in November of 1945. On his last evening at the camp, he ate a final meal in the mess hall: chicken and rice, corn, bread, butter, and rice pudding for dessert. He ate slowly, aware that this abundance would not continue once he left American territory. The ship carrying him and several hundred other repatriated prisoners docked in Hamburg in December of 1945. The city was unrecognizable. Allied bombing had reduced vast sections to rubble. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their windows empty, their roofs collapsed. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and grey and exhausted. Friedrich made his way to Stuttgart, travelling by whatever transportation he could find. Trains that ran sporadically, trucks that offered rides to former soldiers, long stretches on foot through a landscape of destruction. Stuttgart had suffered heavily from bombing. His old neighbourhood was damaged, many buildings destroyed or uninhabitable. He found his wife and children living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed apartment building. They had survived, but the years of war had marked them. His wife Anna was thin, her face lined with stress. His children barely recognized him. They had been young when he left for North Africa, and he had been gone for more than 2 years. The reunion was emotional but also awkward. They had become strangers to each other. The experience of war and separation had changed all of them in ways that were difficult to bridge. In the weeks that followed, Friedrich struggled to readjust to life in defeated Germany. Food was scarce. The official ration in late 1945 provided perhaps 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. Black markets flourished, but prices were astronomical, and payment was often in cigarettes or other barter goods rather than worthless currency. Friedrich found himself thinking about the meals he had eaten in Camp Herne: rice and pork, rice and chicken, fresh vegetables, milk. The comparison was unavoidable and painful. As a prisoner in America, he had eaten better than he now ate as a free man in Germany. One evening, in January of 1946, Anna managed to obtain a small amount of rice through a connection with American occupation troops. She cooked it carefully, stretching it as far as possible, serving it with a thin vegetable soup. The children ate eagerly, scraping their bowls clean. Friedrich ate slowly, tasting the rice, remembering. The texture was the same, but the context had changed completely. This rice, obtained with difficulty and prepared as a rare treat, was fundamentally different from the rice that had appeared on his tray 3 times a week in Texas. Anna noticed his expression. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Friedrich hesitated, then decided to tell her. In the prison camp in America, we had rice regularly, 2 or 3 times per week, sometimes more, served with meat, vegetables, and bread. We ate better as prisoners than I ate as a soldier, better than you and the children ate here at home. Anna absorbed this information in silence. Finally, she said, "Then we fought the wrong enemy." "We fought an enemy we could never defeat," Friedrich corrected. "The difference in resources was too great. We should have known. Perhaps some did know, but chose not to say." Over the following years, as Germany began the slow process of reconstruction under Allied occupation, Friedrich Bauer rebuilt his life. He found work, first in manual labor, and later in his pre-war profession as a mechanic. His children grew up in a Germany that was divided, occupied, and fundamentally changed from the nation he had known before the war. He rarely spoke about his experiences as a prisoner of war. When asked, he said simply that he had been treated fairly, that the Americans had followed the Geneva Convention, that he had survived. He did not mention the rice, the abundance, the psychological impact of being fed so well by the enemy. But in private moments, when he tasted rice in the years after the war, he remembered the mess hall at Camp Herne, the serving line, the portions that had seemed impossible. He remembered the cognitive dissonance of eating meat and rice while his family went hungry in Germany. He remembered the slow realization that everything he had been taught about American weakness was a lie, and that Germany had challenged an enemy whose productive capacity was so overwhelming that defeat was inevitable. Klaus Richter, the Bavarian sergeant who had kept notes throughout his captivity, returned to Munich in early 1946. He found his wife and children alive but living in a single room in a building that had partially survived Allied bombing. His pre-war profession had been teaching, but the education system was in chaos in occupied Germany, and finding work was difficult. Years later, in the 1970s, Klaus was interviewed by a historian studying German prisoners of war in America. The interviewer asked what had surprised him most about his captivity. Klaus thought for a long moment before answering. "The rice?" he finally said. "We were served rice regularly, as a common side dish, as if it were potatoes or bread. In Germany, rice was exotic, expensive, something most people rarely ate. In America, it was ordinary. That single fact told me more about the balance of power in the war than any battle report or propaganda broadcast. When your enemy treats luxury items as ordinary staples and feeds them to prisoners, you understand that you are facing something far beyond your capacity to resist." The interviewer pressed. "So, the food made you doubt Germany's ability to win?" "The food made me realize we had already lost," Klaus corrected. "Lost before the war even began, lost in the fundamental mismatch between our resources and theirs. We were taught that discipline and ideology would overcome material disadvantages. We learned, too late, that material reality always wins in the end." Ernst Heinemann, the corporal from Hamburg who had struggled with guilt over eating well while his family suffered, returned to a Hamburg that was perhaps 60% destroyed by Allied bombing. His wife had survived, but one of his children had died during the war, killed in a bombing raid in 1944. The grief was overwhelming and permanent. Ernst found work in the reconstruction effort, helping to clear rubble and rebuild infrastructure under Allied supervision. The work was hard, the pay minimal, the food scarce. He lived with memories of abundance in America and the stark reality of scarcity in defeated Germany. In his diary, which he continued to keep sporadically after the war, he wrote in 1948, "I have had time now to think about what happened, about the war and its outcome. I believe we were defeated not by better tactics or braver soldiers, but by an enemy that could afford generosity. They fed us rice and meat while we were their prisoners. They treated us according to laws and conventions that we violated. They demonstrated through simple daily actions that their system, their economy, their way of organizing society was more productive and ultimately more powerful than ours. This is a bitter lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. We worshipped strength and discipline. They practiced abundance and law. In the end, abundance and law defeated strength and discipline. The experience of German prisoners of war in American camps during World War II was a small footnote in the larger history of the conflict. The strategic battles, the dramatic turning points, the liberation of concentration camps, the defeat of Nazi Germany. These were the events that shaped the post-war world and filled history books. But for the men who lived through captivity in America, who ate rice 3 times a week and gained weight while their families starved, who witnessed firsthand the productive capacity of American agriculture and industry, the experience was transformative. It taught them something that no propaganda could convey: that material reality matters more than ideology, that productive capacity determines outcomes, that abundance is a form of power more decisive than military courage. The rice, that simple grain served as a side dish to prisoners of the war, became a symbol of everything Germany had misunderstood about the enemy they chose to fight. It represented the vast agricultural capacity of American farming, the logistical sophistication of American supply systems, and the industrial strength that could afford to feed prisoners well, while simultaneously supplying armies on multiple continents. Years after the war, decades later, when these former prisoners tasted rice in peacetime Europe, many of them remembered. They remembered the mess halls, the serving lines, the portions that had seemed impossible. They remembered the cognitive dissonance, the guilt, the slow realization that they had fought for a cause that was doomed from the start. And some of them, in their final years, admitted quietly to family members or historians that they had learned more about power and defeat from those prison camp meals than from any battle they had fought. Rice had taught them what German propaganda never could: that war is decided not by ideology or racial theory, but by the prosaic mathematics of calories, production capacity, and the ability to sustain armies across time and distance. The Third Reich promised its soldiers that discipline and superiority would bring victory. America responded by serving rice to prisoners 3 times a week, meat with every meal, and abundance that made a mockery of Nazi claims about American weakness. In the end, the rice was both a kindness and a weapon. It kept prisoners healthy according to international law, and it simultaneously demonstrated the futility of Germany's war aims. It was soft power in its most literal form, the power to feed one's enemies better than they could feed themselves. The prisoners returned to Germany carrying this knowledge. Most never spoke of it publicly. The shame was too great, the implications too devastating. But they knew, and they remembered, and some of them passed that memory on to children and grandchildren who would grow up in a very different Germany, one rebuilt with American aid, integrated into Western institutions, and finally prosperous enough that rice became an ordinary item in German kitchens. By the 21st century, Germans consumed approximately 7 kilograms of rice per person per year, 10 times the pre-war rate. Rice had become a common ingredient in German cooking, featured in salads, side dishes, and fusion cuisines. The transformation was complete. What had been exotic in 1943 was ordinary 80 years later, but for the generation that had eaten rice as prisoners in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, the grain never lost its symbolic weight. It remained forever associated with the moment they understood that Germany had lost the war. Lost it not through betrayal or bad luck, but through the simple, overwhelming fact that their enemy possessed resources and productive capacity beyond anything German propaganda had prepared them to understand. The rice, in the end, was a lesson in power, not the power of violence or conquest, but the deeper power of abundance, of systems that produce enough to feed both citizens and enemies, of economies that function even under the strain of global war. It was a lesson that arrived on a plate, 3 times a week, steaming and ordinary, and it changed forever how those who ate it understood the world. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.